There is a number that the Pentagon does not want you to know. A number so alarming that when it came out, senior military commanders privately panicked. That number is 80. As in, America has already burned through 80% of its most critical missile defense interceptors in this war against Iran, and the war is not over. The Strait of Hormuz is still blocked. The sailors are still at sea. And Iran, according to its own military, still has 75% of its missile and drone capabilities fully intact and ready to fire. Think about that for a moment. America fired first, hit over 13,000 targets in the first 39 days alone, and Iran is still standing with 3/4 of its firepower untouched. That is not a victory, that is a warning. And today, I'm going to break down exactly how America got here, and what happens next. Let us start with the weapons, because this is the story that changes everything. When the US went to war against Iran in February of this year, it launched one of the most intense air campaigns in modern military history. Tomahawk missiles, JASSM strikes, precision strike missiles, THAAD interceptors, Patriot batteries, all of them deployed at a scale the world had not seen in decades. And it worked, in the sense that American firepower is overwhelming and accurate. Nobody disputes that. But here is what nobody told the American public. Those weapons take years to manufacture. The supply chains are slow. The factories cannot simply double or triple output overnight. And now, according to reports from multiple senior Pentagon sources, fewer than 278 THAAD ballistic missile interceptors remain in U.S. stockpiles. Fewer than 827 Patriot interceptors. The Army has depleted most of its Army tactical missile systems. Most of its precision strike missiles are gone. Analysts are saying it could take years, not months, years, to fully replenish these stockpiles. And Iran knows this. Iran has been watching every missile launch, every interceptor fired. They have been calculating, and their strategy is becoming clearer by the day. Do not try to defeat America in one big battle. Just outlast it. Make it keep spending weapons it cannot quickly replace. Wait until the cupboard is empty, and then negotiate from strength. Now here's where it gets even more serious. While America's weapons are running low, Iran struck again just this past Friday. An oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz, owned by Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, was hit by an Iranian strike. The UAE confirmed it, and this is not just a military story. This is an economic catastrophe unfolding in slow motion. The Strait of Hormuz, before this war began, was the pathway for 20% of the entire world's oil supply. 20%. Every fifth barrel of oil that powers factories, cars, hospitals, and homes across the planet passed through that narrow strip of water. That water is now a war zone. Shipping has collapsed. Vessel traffic remains stalled. Global oil stockpiles are rapidly dwindling according to the International Energy Agency. And now there is an oil spill. From a tanker called the Caroline Bezengi, washing up on the shores of Keshem Island near the strait. Iran is demanding compensation. The environmental damage is being compared to one of the worst oil disasters in history, and nobody in Washington seems to have a plan to stop it. Meanwhile, what is Trump saying? He went on Truth Social and declared that America has, and I want you to listen carefully to this, total control over the Strait of Hormuz. He called the naval blockade a wall of steel. He said Iran has no navy, no air force, no money, and that the IRGC is decimated and fleeing. But here is the problem. Shipping data does not match that claim. Vessel tracking firms show traffic through this strait is still sharply constrained. Ships are not moving freely. Insurance costs for any vessel attempting to cross have gone through the roof. And Iran just hit an Emirati tanker on Friday. That is not what total control looks like. That is what a stalemate looks like. And a senior advisor to the commander of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps said something this week that should make every American pay attention. He said Iran's strategy is to prolong this war, to stretch it out until Trump is out of office. Not to win on the battlefield, just to survive long enough that a new American administration has to deal with the consequences. That is a strategy, and right now it appears to be working. Now let us talk about the human cost, because behind all these geopolitical numbers and weapon stockpile reports, there are real people paying the price. The USS Abraham Lincoln, the aircraft carrier that has become the symbol of this war, has now been at sea for nearly 9 months. 9 months. The CENTCOM commander flew out to meet with the troops aboard the ship this past weekend. Why? Because families back home have been raising alarms, mental health struggles, sailors under impossible pressure. The stories coming out of that ship are heartbreaking. These are young men and women, some of them teenagers when they enlisted, who have been stuck in one of the most dangerous bodies of water on Earth for the better part of a year. No meaningful rotation, no clear end in sight, and now reports say the ship is finally expected to be replaced by the USS George Washington. But 9 months. 9 months at sea in an active war zone with a depleted military and a blocked strait and a president claiming total control on social media while shipping data tells a completely different story. That is the gap between perception and reality in this war, and that gap has a cost, measured not just in weapons and oil prices, but in the mental and physical health of the people actually fighting it. Here's the question I want to leave you with before part 2. America entered this war expecting a quick victory. The expectation was days, maybe 2 weeks, and Iran would fall in line. Instead, 6 months later, America has burned through most of its critical missile defense stockpile. Iran has struck again this week. The Strait of Hormuz is still blocked, global oil markets are in crisis, sailors are suffering, and Iran's own military says 75% of their firepower is still intact. At what point does the definition of success change? At what point does someone in Washington stand up and say, the assumptions we started with were wrong and we need a new plan? That moment has not come yet, but the weapon stockpile has a bottom, and America is getting close to it. In part 2, I am going to show you what happens when the weapons run out. What happens to the Strait of Hormuz? What happens to global oil prices? And most importantly, is there actually a deal being made right now? Or is Trump just buying time? Subscribe and come back for part 2. Because this is where the story gets most dangerous. Diplomacy is supposed to be the way out of a war. You fight, you talk, you reach a deal, you go home. That is how wars are supposed to end. So why, after 6 months of fighting, multiple ceasefires, multiple rounds of talks, and multiple deadlines, is the Strait of Hormuz still blocked? Why is Iran still striking tankers? Why are American sailors still at sea 9 months into a deployment? The answer is not complicated. It is deeply uncomfortable, and today I am going to lay it out completely. Because the deal that everyone is waiting for keeps almost happening, and then it falls apart, again and again. And each time it falls apart, the situation gets a little bit worse. The weapon stockpile gets a little bit lower, and the world gets a little bit closer to an oil shock that nobody is prepared for. Let us start with the negotiations, because there is actually significant movement happening right now that most people are not fully understanding. Iran and Oman are in what officials are calling the final stages of drafting an agreement on commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Oman has been the quiet diplomat in this conflict, trusted by both sides, neutral enough to carry messages, experienced enough to understand the technical details. And the framework they are working on would give Iran more control over which vessels pass through the strait and under what conditions. That is a significant concession. Iran would essentially be recognized as having legitimate authority over one of the most important waterways on Earth. And from Iran's perspective, that is not a small thing. That is one of the outcomes they went to war to achieve. But here is where it gets complicated. Trump has been announcing that a deal is coming almost every single week for the past month. He said it would happen Wednesday, then Thursday, then he extended it again. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said a deal may be imminent, and then nothing. The deadline passes, the talks continue, and Iran launches another strike. Why does this keep happening? Because there is a gap between what Trump needs politically and what Iran will actually agree to. Trump needs to be able to stand in front of the American public and say, "Was, we won. We forced Iran to reopen the strait. We achieved our objective." Iran will not give him that, because for Iran, the framing matters as much as the substance. If the deal looks like Iran surrendered to American military pressure, it is politically impossible for the new Iranian leadership to accept it. So they keep finding ways to slow the process down, to add conditions, to demand things that look like equality rather than defeat. And that is a gap that no amount of diplomatic language has been able to bridge. Yet. Meanwhile, the economic damage is compounding every single day this drags on. Before this war, the Strait of Hormuz carried 20% of the world's oil supply. That flow has been cut to a fraction of its normal volume. The International Energy Agency has now issued a formal warning that global oil stockpiles are rapidly dwindling. Saudi Arabia, America's most important Gulf partner, is not just watching the economic damage. It is now dealing with its own security crisis. Saudi officials told CNN this week that the kingdom is bracing for multiple coordinated attacks by Iraqi militias working alongside Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. Yemen's military has ramped up operations against the Houthis. New fronts are opening. Every week that the Hormuz deal does not close, the conflict spreads a little further. And the countries that America needs as partners to broker a solution are increasingly focused on defending themselves, rather than helping Washington find an exit. And then there is the weapons question, which I told you about in Part 1, and which is becoming more urgent by the day. America has burned through nearly 80% of its Thaad missile interceptors. Fewer than 827 Patriot interceptors remain. The Army is critically short on long-range precision missiles, and analysts say it could take years to rebuild those stockpiles. Iran, according to its own military commanders, still has 75% of its missile and drone capabilities intact. So here is the brutal arithmetic. If diplomacy fails and America decides to launch another major strike campaign against Iran, it will be doing so with a dramatically depleted weapons inventory, against an opponent that still has most of its firepower. And every missile America fires in a new escalation is a missile that cannot be replaced quickly, and cannot be used somewhere else in the world if another crisis erupts. That is the strategic trap America has walked itself into, and it is not a trap you can threaten your way out of. Now let us talk about what Jared Kushner is doing, because this is one of the most interesting developments of the past 48 hours. Kushner, Trump's son-in-law and longtime Middle East envoy, has been conducting rare talks in Egypt. He met with Hamas leadership to try to advance a Gaza ceasefire plan that Israel has already rejected, and he is expected to meet with Netanyahu this week. This matters because it tells you something important about where the Trump administration's priorities actually are. While the Hormuz negotiations are stalling, while the weapons stockpile is shrinking, while sailors are struggling 9 months into deployment, the people closest to Trump are focused on Gaza, on Israel, on a ceasefire framework that the Israelis themselves have not agreed to, which raises a question that more and more military analysts are starting to ask openly. Is America's Iran policy actually about America's strategic interests, or is it still being shaped primarily by the needs and preferences of a foreign government? That question does not have a comfortable answer. What it does have is consequences, and those consequences are becoming visible. Every ceasefire in this conflict has broken down. Every deadline has been missed or extended. Every announcement of an imminent deal has been followed by more strikes, more delays, more tankers hit, more oil washing up on beaches. The USS Abraham Lincoln has been at sea for 9 months. The weapons stockpile is critically low. Iran's strategy, outlast Trump, survive until a new administration, is being executed patiently and deliberately. And the world is watching a 20% oil supply being held hostage, while the most powerful military in history runs low on the missiles it needs to fight, and cannot manufacture them fast enough to stay ahead of the depletion. The most important question in global politics right now is not whether America wins or loses this war on a battlefield. It is whether anyone in Washington has a plan that accounts for the reality on the ground, rather than the reality they wish existed, because hope is not a strategy, and running out of weapons while waiting for a deal that keeps not closing is not a position of strength. It is a position that gets more dangerous every single day. Comment Caro. Do you think a deal gets done before the weapons run completely out? Or does this escalate into something even bigger? Subscribe, because this story is moving fast and I will be here every step of the way.